right?
That was a terrific session, and this is a question for Rich. First time I heard you give this paper.
One time you thought I was right, the next time you thought I was wrong.
Right. Yeah, so there's like a over time paradox you can have with yourself. But I think there's a kind of instability in the view you defended in the paper, and you hinted at it yourself, but I think you might not have appreciated how unstable it is. So you defend the view that in these situations, quote, reasonable disagreement situations, you should withhold, suspend belief. But then you said, but of course there are people who disagree with me about that, so I should suspend belief about that as well. And presumably about that as well, and at each level. But presumably the statement P, but I should suspend belief about P is more paradoxical, I think. Yeah. So I don't think you can even state your view without paradox.
That would be bad. I guess I'm not. Where did you get me committed to the view that what I should do is believe P, but I should suspend judgment about P?
Because P is the view. Let P be level one view that you should withhold judgment. P is your paper.
Yeah.
But you have to withhold belief about that because people disagree with you.
Right.
And that will be true at each level. So at every level, let that be P, and then you have to withhold about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, I did, I guess you're drawing out the self-defeating character of this view, and I did allude to that, right? I mean, I said you should have gone to the museum.
I think it's a really cool shoe.
You're right. I think you're right. I mean, the view seems to commit to something like that, and I think I'm not sure how exactly I put it. It does nevertheless seem to me that those principles are true. I feel okay about reporting that fact about myself, and I guess I think I'm committed to, depending on how much assertion and how much how well justified I'm supposed to be in order to assert it. We could worry about all that, and I have to be very cautious about that. So I think you're right, and I can't. Given that people disagree with me, peers disagree with me about all these, I can't consistently assert with confidence E and C are true and the argument. So you're right. And I'm not. So I guess if I stick with the view from the paper, what I have to do is not assert those things and maybe just report. Well, it sort of looks that way to me, but what's that worth?
Claudio, after that, Professor Klein. Claudio.
Well, this is really quick. I think you did a great job, Rich, and I agree with either you or Tom. I don't know which, and I don't think I can figure out in just about 10 seconds. So I'll just have a question for Mike. That'll be easier, I think, because there I may be able to help or maybe suggest something. You seem to see your, let's say, your disagreement with Alvin Plantinga, for instance. If you take him to be a peer, and that's what I think you would do. You seem to think that that must be trouble for this kind of view, right? Because you still can't come to agree with him. You stick by your guns, and And you should, according to Rich, I suppose, withhold judgment with regard to whether there is a God or something like that. Is that right? But I would like to suggest that there is a hypothesis that reconciles that with evidentialism, and that is to take people who would disagree about that kind of thing to have mystical experiences that you don't have. So they don't need to have arguments in order for evidentialism, I understand, to be correct about that, because if there are such mystical experiences, that would still count as evidence in those cases. So they can still be rational, even though they cannot persuade you by argument, and of course they cannot provide you with those mystical experiences. There is such a thing. Is that helpful?
Actually, that's kind of exactly what I was thinking, is what you're saying is, and I was thinking that would be uncomfortable for Richard to accept. But my idea was there's this kind of disagreement. It's not technically what Richard called a disagreement. There could be a case where when I consider something, I mean, I don't know either way. I mean, I have no view about it. And then I encounter these people, and they tell me, oh no, there's, I have this very strong, I have these experiences, and as a result of them, it seems I feel very certain in the truth of whatever. In this case, maybe the existence of some sort of divine being. And then what I was thinking is, remember, I introduced this by saying, it can look like Richard's view always drives you to withhold, but in these kind of cases, it looks like it might drive you to believe, because what I should say is just what you're saying. Okay, as far as my evidence goes, I don't know, it doesn't count much either way. Now this other person's telling me this stuff, so that evidence of evidence is evidence, so now I've acquired this powerful evidence that I ought to, I mean, just what you said. I should think about the mystic and say, he's got this powerful evidence, I've got none either way, I better believe what he says. Just as if I'd been sitting in here all afternoon and he came in and said, my God, it's, the sun came out and it's shining out there.
Well, that'd be just right for him to say.
So I agree with you, and I was just thinking, Richard, well, I'm not entirely comfortable about that.
Well, wait, I guess I'm puzzled. I mean, if you think that's right, you think when the mystic tells you he's had a religious experience, you're conceding, and I take it you think you're rationally agreeing that is evidence for him.
The experience?
Yeah.
He certainly takes it to be evidence.
Well, then I take it then it's right that you should think now there really is some evidence for the religious proposition. Yes. Yeah, right? I mean, I don't see why is that uncomfortable for me?
Okay. If it's not, then fine.
Good. Maybe I'm missing it. I take that.
See, actually,
Yeah, right. I mean, I wonder in that particular case, I wonder about whether it's really evidence, but that's a different.
This is Glenn.
For Rich, there's probably nothing under the heavens and skies that's not been dreamt of by my philosophic peers or betters. And so, for example, Peter Unger thinks there are no tables. Van Inwagen thinks everything is some sort of an organic thing. Stitch thinks there are no beliefs. And so it's not...
That one is the most trouble.
Well, okay, take that. So there's not this sharp division between beliefs about Xerox machines and philosophic beliefs. Not all philosophic beliefs are about is there free will or something about which I have no opinion going into it. Is your skepticism, I mean, am I now supposed to think, is that evidence that there are no beliefs and that there are no tables and there are no hands? That these peers now have, I mean, they are my peers or betters. I don't think they may have some different information than I do, but the relevant background beliefs seem to me to be the same. Mm-hmm. They at least reason as well, if not better, than I do. They come to these conclusions. Does that lend any, I mean, now should I start, maybe there aren't people with beliefs Maybe there aren't moral principles. It's all expressive.
Well, let me say two things. Yes and no. No, I guess, actually, I guess I want to say the following. I said at the very end that I think that some of the disagreements are, there's linguistic issues, so there's matters about what's meant by, say, belief. And I think, say, that's a good example about that one, whether I think sort of, in my mind, the best case for the argument, for the kinds of arguments that end with there are no beliefs, packs a lot into what the concept of belief is, and if you give them that definition, then maybe you want to say they're okay, and there's no disagreement. So I guess one thing to worry about is to apply all this, and I don't have it worked out in anything resembling a satisfactory way. But the idea is that I think a lot of the disagreements are merely apparent.
At least with regard to Stitch, he's going to say, as part of his view, look, I mean by belief exactly what you folk mean.
Yeah.
And so my peer is now telling me, if I think he means something different by belief than I do, my peer is saying, no, that's wrong. So I probably have to credit that a little bit as well, or...
Well, the view I've spelled out, I guess, says you do. And
Can I say one thing about this? I think the relative unpopularity, although not complete, a relative unpopularity of these views actually cuts the other way. Because I think, Rich was mostly talking about the case where there's two epistemic peers. But if you're giving your epistemic peer equal weight, then it seems like the whole class of epistemic peers should get equal weight. So really, it's kind of a democracy, right? You start counting the votes of all the qualified people. So the skeptic might be even in more trouble, right? I want to look at the skeptical arguments. Rich wants to not only, well, maybe he doesn't want to look at the arguments at all, because we're trying to push him, but he wants to kind of count hands at the end. And
well, let me just say...
But I don't want to count hands
That's
at
right.
the end. I mean,
That's unfair.
And for reasons that you have explained and we've talked about. But if counting hands were right, you could win the day by wiping out the opposition, and that's surely not the right thing to do. Yeah.
We talk about there do not have to be actual epistemic
Right.
as long as it's possible to think of them being easily developed.
Yeah. Well, which is more. That's more puzzling. Yeah.
And it's a very preliminary.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah, this is a question about the evidence principle. So, so I believe that P, you believe that not P. I suppose we are epistemic peers. So, I should say you're believing that P as evidence for P, and vice versa. Now, why? You seem to be applying this principle only once. But why shouldn't I now take it, that you believe it as P as evidence for P, as further evidence for P?
Right.
And, well, and then, obviously I shouldn't, so why should I apply it in the first?
Yeah. I think in a part that Peter just alluded to that I didn't read, it's really, I think, in the end, not the mere fact that you believe something that's evident, that's evidentially significant. It's rather something like this. If and it doesn't apply so well to the real cases, but when suppose I think something and I think, well, everybody agrees, and then I find out you don't. When that happens, then I learn, I have a kind of at least some evidence. Well, gee, given what I know about you, there must be some evidence that you have. And then if we talk about it, maybe I find out what that is. And it's that's really doing the work, rather than the mere fact of your belief. And so there's nothing more to do. I mean, there's no, if I'm understanding your question, I don't have to do it over and over again.
But when we share evidence, you know what's the evidence that I have? It's the same that you have, right?
Well,
I mean, the only additional fact is that I take it to support P.
right. So what I learned in the case at hand is, suppose the idea I'm thinking is, well, I think, everybody's going to see that this set of the right conclusion to draw from this information is P, and then I discover, but you don't. Okay, so that's the new piece of information, and if the seemings or whatever it is that's the basis for your coming to that conclusion about what conclusion to draw from the evidence, if that counts as evidence, that's the new thing I've learned. So I guess if the sort of push the evidence not to the mere fact of belief, but whatever it is that indicates, then I'm not seeing why I have to sort of repeatedly apply it. Yeah. Am I missing the question?
Okay.
Reading and then Professor Feldman and
I'm also one.
the last.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'm very sympathetic to skeptical attitude and this suspending judgment in most philosophical cases. And so what I'm going to say is in the spirit of perhaps improving or making some suggestions,
Okay.
not as objections. In fact, it's to avoid some objections.
Great.
What seems, first of all, a bit strange to me, or what struck me, is that you don't mention arguments here. It's everything based on evidence and peers.
Well, evidence and philosophical arguments could be part of the evidence.
Well, but then I think you should talk more about it, because, if you want to suspend judgment between P and not P, what appears to me by listening to you is that if someone thinks not P and I think P, and he's an epistemic peer, just because he has a different view, then I have to suspend judgment also, because he's a peer as good as I am. Equality is put into the peer and not the argument he can give me in favor of not P. Because when it comes to evidence and you say, well, perhaps argument could be inside the evidence, I would say if everybody share the evidence, so arguments are equal. But it's not true. If you have a reasonable disagreement, I take it, you think P and I think not P. And you have one argument for not P and I have an argument for P. And it's reasonable because we can give reasons for thinking P and for thinking not P. And so we don't share the evidence, because then the arguments must be different. And if I'm going to suspend judgment, it is because your argument is as good as mine. It's not because you're a good peer as I am, epistemically speaking. You may be a good peer and I may be a bad peer, but in this case I have a good argument and you don't, or the other way around. So what matters, really, is argument. So I think the notion of epistemic peer or equality is useless at bottom, okay? Chateaubriand is right when he says, well, my epistemic peer might be a mathematician, or an economicist, or a Platonist, or a Husserlian. It doesn't matter the background. What matters is the argument. If you have a good argument for not P, as good as mine, I will suspend judgment. So, now the second point is, if you have a disagreement there, the problem is not exactly evidence. I think you have to introduce the problem of criterion. Which is the criterion by which I'm going to settle the disagreement? Is it evidence? Well, this is controversial. Is it intuition, a seeming, an insight? Well, these are not rational criteria to decide. If it's a reasonable disagreement, we need a rational criterion. These are not a rational way to settle it. So I'm going to suspend judgment because I see no criterion. So and you don't mention criterion. So these are my suggestions.
Okay. With respect to the second point, what I did in the paper was to adopt, at least for the sake of discussion, and a view that I find somewhat congenial, is that there's some notion of intellectual insight, or Mike wanted to use the phrase seeming, I forget, Van Inwagen and Rosen had similar phrases, and I was taking them as evidence. So the fact that it seems clear to me that P is evidence for P. I think what you just said was, I think you just said that those were non-evidential factors. So if you think that, then we just have to look at what the evidence supports and decide on the basis of that. But I guess the view that I had here was to take those things as evidence. So I guess I do disagree about, at least the perspective I have on this doesn't say that we're going beyond evidence when we do that. Now, you say the arguments matter, not the peers, sort of not the first point was sort of, isn't it the arguments that matter and not the people? And in a way, yes, and that was part of what I was saying about Juan, in response to Juan. But I think sometimes the people matter. I mean, testimonial arguments are arguments, and the peers come in that way. The facts about what your peers believe is in a way evident. They tells you something about them, and so provides a kind of argument. So I think we can't quite so easily sort of segregate things out, say the arguments matter, not the peers. It's a more complicated matter than that. I think one other thing I want to say, not directly on that point, but it bears on a number of the questions and some of the stuff back to what Tom said, is this. There's an issue here that I find very puzzling, and I don't have a worked out view about it, but it's clearly making a big difference here. And it's this. There's sort of the base level evidence you have, and then there's sort of thoughts you have about the quality of that evidence. And one of the things that's playing a significant role in my whole paper is how those things interact and what effect a view about the merits of the argument, of the evidence or the arguments have on the justification of your belief. And Tom's way of framing it is very helpful, and here's just another example that will bring out the question. Suppose a student of taught by a skeptic, gets taught a lot of good argument, a lot of interesting, persuasive arguments that might make it pretty reasonable for that person to believe that she doesn't really have very good reasons to believe things. And then she looks around the room and sort of can't help but believe that there's a bunch of people and there's chairs. And there's this question, well, how should we assess that belief when there's sort of the experiential evidence that looks pretty good evidence that there are chairs, and in fact is, but then there's a kind of good reason to think, but it's not good evidence that she's got, and how do you put those things together and assess the overall, the epistemic status of the base level belief? And I think what my paper commits me to is placing a lot of weight on that meta-level argument, and I think what Tom is pushing me toward is not placing so much weight on that, and I'm torn on that. I don't know what to say. I mean, it seems very hard. If you want to say that you really have a pretty good reason to think it's not good evidence, but on the other hand, it is good evidence, it looks like the person is in a position where the following two things are justified. P, but I don't have any good reasons for P. And that doesn't sound so good. So I'm puzzled by all of that. I'll stop.
We'll have now the last question, and after that, Klaus Almeida will say some words. Professor Feldman.
One quick point. I think the instability that Stu is pointing to might not be so terrible, because I really don't think there is paradox in asserting I believe that P, and I also don't have much of a reason to believe P. Yeah, but all you have to do is stick an I believe that in front of the whole paper, and now you got rid of the the instability. It's an autobiographical report, which is going to influence an awful lot of other people.
Well, it's an autobiographical report explaining what purports to be a rational progression of
Right.
thought.
But the more serious question is that when I was talking to you a bit about before, I think it's an extension of Mike's point, that you and I are both fairly radical foundationalists who take very seriously the idea that all knowledge and justified beliefs proceeds from what we know rather unproblematically and very well about the contents of our own mental state. And it seems to me it's a little odd for you to get to other people and start taking into account what they think to the extent to which you can know it at all. I mean, I don't want to reel too much about my own pathologies, but I really do think you can get yourself in a frame of mind where it's pretty mysterious what's going on in the heads of other people around you. It's certainly the case, as you pointed out, that you got to wonder what somebody like Stitch is thinking when he says what he says. The church ones, you don't think there are any pains, huh? That's really
It's
interesting.
better if you say you think there are no pains.
Yeah, you better not say that. I mean, well, you say that and hope that you trap them into saying, yes, I think there are no mental states. But there's so many problems with even trying to figure out what's going on in the minds of others. Don't you think that's going to seriously undermine the idea that you can easily get yourself into one of these, well, I think this and my reasoning is such and such, but then you move to this existential proposition about something going on in the mind of another person? Given your foundationalism.
Maybe I'm less skeptical than you about communicating with people some. But, I mean, I guess apply it. So apply it, take the religious case, take the free will case, Van Inwagen and Lewis on that one, take the case about, take some real world cases of, sort of political matters and the like, and I guess I'm just not so much moved by those worries about whether I really can know what you're thinking. So when say I do have some fairly strong political beliefs, and then I encounter people who I genuinely trust, who and respect, who will see those things very differently, and that does trouble me, and and it certainly gives me pause, and it's not the case that I sort of those kinds of worries, like what in the world could they be talking about?
No, but in those kinds of cases, don't you think it's the case that especially in the political cases, and often in the philosophy cases, you alluded to this before, you know perfectly well you never really had very good reason for believing a lot of what you believed.
Right.
I spout off on politics all the time, but do I even have very good reason for thinking that the consequences are going to be such and such?
Right.
And conversations with other people certainly reminded me occasionally that my evidence base was kind of pathetic to begin with.
Right.
And if you're honest, you'll think that. You actually don't even need other people to reach that conclusion. You just reflect a little bit more carefully on your evidence base to begin with.
Right. I think that's right. I mean, that's the point that a couple of people have sort of pushed on, that it's not really the other people. What the other people are sort of occasions to bring to mind evidence. Sometimes it genuinely does. You do learn something new from talking to somebody else. That didn't come out sounding right. That's not what I meant. But I mean, on these topics, I mean, you know, on sort of a major political issue, well, you know there's going to be smart people on the other side even before you read or hear what they say. So yeah, I think that's entirely right. And I guess this discussion is leading me to think that the section I skipped about sort of the role of the peers is actually probably deserves more prominence than I gave it. It's the existence of the arguments or the considerations on the other side that really matters. And I think you're right that in cases that most interest me, I think what I already know is that at best my evidence is pretty modest. And so in a way, what maybe the paper amounts to is the point that we're probably not, that I think we're not very well justified on in these genuinely controversial cases. I don't have a good way to segregate out that case from, say, the fiction on belief or something. It does seem different to me. Maybe my thought is, this fits with other things sort of in other domains, that people have opinions about these hard topics. I think a worldly observation is people have much more confident beliefs about these big issues than they're entitled to.
We thank Professor Feldman for your case. Very interesting paper.
Well, folks, I just want to thank you for this wonderful conference, and I hope it won't be too long till we see you back here in this conference room. There are a number of people to thank, my colleagues at the philosophy department who have been very supportive, my students, Danuzia and Juliano, for helping manage the room, and I have a very, well, of course, Enrique Villanueva for taking chances with this Brazilian partner. And I have a very special thank you to the two people who have gone several extra miles to make this a memorable experience to us all. I think we should all be grateful to them. Ernie Sosa and my tireless assistant, Rodrigo.